Well, welcome everybody to day two of and part three of trade data analysis. Today we're going to be doing a hands-on session, like I promised yesterday, and this will mean that you don't have to do anything except possibly when you receive the PowerPoint later. Nina will send it later today. You could go through, try and copy follow what I've done, because when it's fresh in your mind, when you've just seen a demonstration, it's often the best time to practice it for yourself. So I'd encourage you to do that. Now, just to say that the portal we're using, the data portal WITS, is not the easiest. So I thought, well, we could do trade map, but that's sort of almost intuitive to figure out how to get data from trade map, but WITS isn't. So I thought, well, I'll be adding more value if I go to WITS. But the big thing about WITS is that it's got a tariff and trade data, and that's very compelling, because otherwise we have to match. I've had to do this several times in the past where I couldn't get a tariff and trade data from WITS from the same source, and I had to match them up, and then it becomes quite a performance to actually do that. So the fact that they've matched them up in their database and we can query it is very powerful. So let's look. Good morning, Amina. Let's look then at what we're going to be doing today. So we won't be spending a lot of time in PowerPoint. I'm just going to give you some slides so that we know where we're going, and so that there's also a framework, a reference framework for this presentation that we can distribute to you. Defining the research question, firstly, identifying the data needed, deciding on the best data source, accessing and downloading the data, cleaning and preparing the data, analysis of the data, and then presentation, write-up of the results. Okay, step 7, I'm not going to write up the results for you here, but what I'm going to do is I will be showing you, at least going as far as the graphics, the visualizations that will form part of it. And what you see here will go into an actual Tralac publication. It will go into a conference 2-pager and may become a trade brief down the line. When you do a paper, then you need to add a little bit more context, a little bit more background to not just one simple research question. One has to flesh it out. And then another thing, and I would have mentioned it yesterday, is that we always add policy recommendations. At Tralac, we always try to add policy recommendations, and you'll find all of the organizations that, especially think tanks like Tralac and the international organizations, are very practical. They're very policy oriented. We investigate, we try to answer questions, we try to tell stories, and then at the end we say, how can we make the world a better place? Almost always we are investigating problems, we're investigating issues, and otherwise you're wasting your time. So we want to know today's question. We'll talk about it now, but it relates to intra-African trade. It relates to increasing intra-African trade, and that is a big part of the work we do at Tralac. So let's go down and then let's define the research question. Now, our purpose: to determine the extent of intra-African tariff protection in the clothing, textile, and leather sector. Why are we asking this question? Well, Tralac research has indicated that this sector is potentially a good candidate for regional intra-African value chain driven development. Let me just define that. A regional value chain is a value chain between countries that are neighbors in the same region generally. Now, the question is Africa a region? It's a massive continent. It has got some of the biggest countries in the world, as in Algeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo are very, very large countries. And it's very far. To get from Cape Town to Cairo is thousands of kilometers. So is it really a region? Well, I think the sub-regions are more like what we would consider regions. Southern Africa is a region. Even that is quite large. East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and then North Africa. And they all have specific characteristics that to some extent unite them. Although there's obviously diversity and what we call heterogeneity as well between these sub-regions. But when we talk about the AFCFTA, we're talking about the whole of Africa. And when we talk about intra-African trade, we mean trade between any African countries, whether it's South Africa and Egypt on two ends of the scale, or South Africa and Lesotho, a country that's completely landlocked by South Africa. Incidentally, I just a quick segue, humorous segue. My wife likes to watch British quiz shows, and I think she was watching The Weakest Link, and the question was, which country completely landlocks Lesotho? And the woman answered Wales, which is in the United Kingdom. So I thought that was quite a sad reflection of British people's grasp of African geography. Okay, so that's what we mean when we talk about a regional value chain. It's relationships, trade relationships between neighbors or people or countries in the same region. And the value chain part of it is simply this, that we're all several countries are part of the production of one product. One finally consumed product is contributed to by several different countries. And value chains, regional value chains were around, but economists started to notice in the 2000s that global value chains had become very important. That a product that was that was sold as a final product by an American company, the best example is Apple, okay, one of the largest market cap companies in the world. But Apple phones were made largely in the Far East, in China and in other Far Eastern countries, because that's also changing. The dynamic is changing in the Far East between China and the other East Asian countries. And that's a global value chain because it's literally one part of the globe to the other. But we in Africa want to develop regional value chains. We want Lesotho to stitch leather seats for cars, and those cars are finally assembled in South Africa or in Egypt or in Algeria or Morocco, because those countries produce. And Kenya, I understand, has a bit of a vehicle industry as well. But it doesn't always make sense. So to get a car seat, a leather car seat that's been produced in Lesotho to Egypt, it is too expensive. It doesn't make sense. So this is what we need to remember with intra-African trade. There will always be some intra-African trade of high-value items, more likely, that happens right across the continent. But most of it will be localized. So the trade connections between the countries in the Southern African Customs Union, South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Eswatini, Namibia, are because they're all close neighbors and because it's relatively quick to get between those countries. Similarly for East Africa, the countries of the East African community. So that's what we mean by regional intra-African value chain driven development. But there's another side to it as well. The sector also has an above average female ownership and female employee proportions. Now, this is not really a surprise because making clothes, making shoes, and working with textiles, that is a traditional sector that women have been more involved with than men. But from a perspective of empowering female entrepreneurs, which is a priority, as one of the sustainable development goals, is to look at gender issues and the socio-economic aspects of gender issues. It's an interesting sector and an important sector to look at. But another thing, and I haven't written it here, but I'll talk about it, is about the clothing, textile, and leather sector, is that typically the tariffs are very high. So not just in Africa, but throughout the world, this is quite a highly protected sector. And you have very strange dynamics. As for example, South Africa imports a lot of its, and other Africa, let's just focus on South Africa, imports a lot of its CTL requirements from countries such as China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, yet it imposes a very high tariff, 40% plus on those imports. And yet those imports can compete with clothing, textile, and leather products that it imports duty-free from Lesotho, which is part of the customs union, from Mauritius, which is part of SADC free trade area. And unfortunately, Kenya is not part of it, because I know they also have a textile industry and their value is very good. So it's a strange sector because trade happens even at these very punitive tariff rates. you still have trade happening. So that's why it interests us. Now, so it interests us because the value chains, there are already some existing value chains, because it's a female empowered sector to some extent, and because the tariffs don't come down. Now, when it comes to or rather the tariffs are very high. When it comes to the African Continental Free Trade Area, we don't know what's going to happen yet. Some countries, such as Egypt's a big textile producer, but also produces clothes, have made offers to the AFCFTA, meaning they have offered to liberalize, to open their markets in these sectors to other African countries. And that's admirable. Other countries such as and the Mauritius, I won't say yet, but not all countries, not many countries have made offers in this sector, and some of them are expected to denote them as sensitive sectors, which means that there's a wind down of the tariff over several years, and some could also denote them as sensitive. So this is a very interesting sector, and we don't know what's going to happen going over the next couple of years into the African Continental Free Trade Area, but we hope that there will be greater liberalization. Okay, identifying the data needed and deciding on data source. Well, let's first see what are the dimensions of the data. In other words, what type of information do we need, if you call them columns or fields in the data set. Firstly, we need all African countries. Now, one thing we find when we go and look for data on African countries is it's very seldom that we find a database that includes all African countries. And even if we do, we often find that there are missing years, there's missing data. And so it can be a bit frustrating. But the good news is that we have most African countries, we can get most African countries for this data from WITS. Secondly, sector. So we need all of the clothing, all of the top level, in other words, the two-digit HS code headings for clothing, textile, and leather sectors. There are actually only 4 that I've selected. I haven't chosen all of them because I want to keep it, not to make it too busy, but if you've looked at trade data, you'll see that there are two-digit headings for clothing, or what they also call apparel. One is knitted or crocheted, and the other is not knitted or crocheted. So I've chosen the not knitted or crocheted one because it's generally a much bigger value line. Then we want the value of tariff barriers. Now these will be AVE, ad valorem equivalent tariffs, because as you may know, tariffs are measured on basically the transaction level of the trade flow. So and trade map and all these, the ComTrade only gives you down to the six-digit level of your harmonized system. So, but the trade actually happens, the products are declared, the products go through customs at the 8 or 10-digit level. Now, the reason the trade data only goes to 6 is because the 8th and 10th levels are user definable. They can be defined by the individual country, and so they're not standardized. So in order to get actual tariff line data or transaction level data, you need to go to commercial suppliers. Now, my dream, I have a dream, and my dream is that the WTO would standardize the 8, standardized, or down to the 10, make it down to the 10 digit. That should keep everyone happy. Standardize the HS system down to the 10-digit level, and then we can get trade data. We can get transaction level trade data from these data portals, and we can do very interesting research there, because we can find out about preference trade area utilization. In other words, do companies actually utilize preferences? Because if they're not, then we need to understand why. Anyway, that's my personal dream. I don't know whether it's ever going to happen. And then fourthly, we need the annual trade flow in USD. We don't need it, but it's a very interesting thing to add, because we can compare the trade flows coming at preferences and the trade flows coming at at MFN, at most favored nation, or at typical tariffs. And we will see. We want to know, are the trade flows at preferences greater than at MFN? And remember, I said that South Africa imports quite a bulk of a lot of its clothing still at MFN tariff rates, which are very high. So that relationship does not necessarily hold. And it all depends on how efficient the producers, the manufacturers of these clothing products are. Then we can also get the year. Now we get the year to determine a trend. In other words, is whatever we see, is it increasing or decreasing? What's been the trend? Now, in reality, I'm only going to get now. So what I did was, after defining this, what you see in front of you, I went to the source, I went to the website, and I looked at what's called data availability. And I saw that actually what we do sometimes find, so the data on some African countries, some years are missing. So I chose, let's do cross-sectional analysis and choose 1 year. And I chose 2015 because it's the most recent year with the most amount of data. I think I could have got data up to 2021, but there are gaps. And the reason this happens is because it just takes a while for data to be sorted out in source countries and cleaned and then forwarded. And the Comtrade have to, and the WTO have to, because the WTO are they're the source of tariff data, whereas UN Comtrade is the source of the trade data. So you're working with, WITS is working with different organizations, pulling together different data and putting it into the same database. So what is the requirement? Well, we're going to go to WITS. What's the requirement? Registration and login is required, but there's no cost involved. The portal is part of the World Bank. The World Bank is a sponsored organization by the contributions of the countries of the world, and so there's no charge for it. And so it's a very powerful asset to have, very valuable asset to have when you're not paying anything for it. What are the next steps? Log into the site, check on data availability, prepare the query. So I checked on data availability. I'll show you when I connect to the portal. I'll show you where to find it, but we won't go into it in detail because it's a bit of you have to really drill into it. But I chose 2015 for the reasons I gave you. And then you prepare the query. That's a couple of steps I'll show you, and then download the data. And then you choose, when downloading the data, you choose your pivot column for the data set, so that you know that basically just gives you a column, a values column, and everything is relative to that. I chose the value of imports for the reporting country because we've only got one of those per reporting country, but we have multiple tariffs for the reporting country for every partner country. So just to clarify what that is, in the parlance, in other words, in the speech of trade data, the reporting country is the reporting country is the country that gives the information. If it's the reporting country's imports, then the partner countries are the ones exporting to the reporting country. So if the reporting country can report on its imports or on its exports, but if it's reporting on its imports, then every partner country, and there'll be multiple of them, are exporting to the reporting country. I mentioned, and just relates also to mirror data, I mentioned yesterday about mirror data. In the case of mirror data, the reporting country, it's opposite. So as long as we know that we're looking at the reporting country as and this is direct data that we're getting from the reporting country. But if it's mirror data, then the reporting country is not the target country. But in this case, we don't know how much of the data is mirror and is not, but it's being entered into the database as the reporting country's data. Secondly, cleaning and preparing the data. For example, one thing we had to do is the years. Okay, no, that was in a different database. But sometimes the years come through as text. Sometimes you have data columns that are formatted as text, and you have to and it's quite quick to do that in Excel. But if you don't format them as numbers, you will get, you won't be able to calculate anything. And it's it's a bit of an irritating thing, but it is something that happens when you use the CSV method of moving data around. If you use Excel, then it should be formatted correctly. Well, I say should, sometimes it isn't. So it always helps to check, and I'll show you just to check, is what looks like a number in Excel actually a number, or is it a number that's actually text? And then filtering and pivoting of the data. So I got rid of some columns. So you'll see we can choose what columns we want to download. I didn't remove them on that side. I just deleted some of them in Excel. It's very quick. Analysis of the data and then presentation right up of the results. So I think, all right, let's go to now what's going to be required is for me to stop a share and then start a share as I move between as we go forward. So at some points I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint and I'll share my Windows, my Chrome, and then we will come back when we need to. So I'm going to stop now and I'm going to share my Chrome instead. There we go. So this is what it looks like when you get to WIT's World Integrated Trade Solution, and then you can see my login details already pre-filled in. Now you don't have to log in to access some of this information. I think you can get some of the utilities and support materials without doing that. But let's log in any case. And as I said, it's free and quick to log in. And this is what happens. There's a welcome page. There's an FAQ, so you can find out information. And let's look along the top here because we have a bunch of drop downs. And these are the types of query or the types of ways you can get data. UN Comtrade by product. Okay, that's the same data from TradeMap. I will just use TradeMap for that. And then you can find trade data on its own, or trade data by, or tariff data. You can also find NTMs, non-tariff measures. That's interesting. And then tariff line imports. So that's something new they've added. I must actually check that out. Now, advanced query is what we are looking at. And so the reason it says UN Comtrade, it says trade data here, it's advanced because here in the quick search, it's either by product or by country. But here, this query will mean you can specify multiple dimensions. So if you want by product, by country, by year, for trade data, then this is the place to come. Now, I chose tariff and trade analysis because we want tariffs and we want trade data in the same database. So that's a popular one to use. You should check out some of the other data here. You can bulk download UN Comtrade and bulk download trains is tariff data. And then there's also a global value chain analysis. Now, remember what I said yesterday, if you get bulk download, you're going to get millions of rows of data. And then you're going to need something like PowerPoint, or if you've used Access to pull the data into Excel, and you'll filter it in Power Pivot. You'll bring it from say you'll bring it into Power Pivot from its outside source as a CSV, and then you can pivot it in Excel. Then there's a very interesting thing here called Smart Tariff and Trade Simulation. I've used that before. What that allows you to do is to create a simulation of, we ask ourselves, what if South Africa liberalized its tariffs on clothing, textile, and leather completely? What would happen to trade with Kenya, for example? And that will simulate that. It'll give you an idea of the increase in trade, and it's got some interesting other things it tells you, that the improvement in the welfare of people. But it is a bit beyond and then you can go here to download and view results. Utilities are creating your own country groups. This helps. I need to create a country group for the whole of Africa. I've got African sub areas, and then create product groups. So you can create groups of, that would be, then it saves you time when you creating a query, you can just pull your own product groups in. I should have done that for the overall African group of nations, and also for the CTL product groups. Then support materials. This is where you find data availability here. It's the first link under support materials. But as you can see, there's help here. There's e-learning, the user manual, video tutorials. So it's worth it to spend a bit of, if you're going to use this for tariffs and for non-tariff measures, etc., then it's very much worth it to get it from here. Okay, now, so let's go to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you formulating the query, but I'm then going to go to my final query, but I'll show you how it's at least formulated. So tariff and trade analysis is what I select. I select a new query, and I need to give it a name, and I can't put anything. You can see some of the ones I've done recently: Zim Lithium, Algeria, Mauritania, Algeria, imports, exports, Africa, CTL. There, that's the one, Africa CTL. So I've already done one like that. But let's just call it certificate course CC test. And then we'll just say certificate course demo. And then we selected a data source, and we want WTOIDB. The reason I'm getting that is because I previously looked in data availability, and I saw that the data we want is in that database. Now I can click, after specifying those fields, I click proceed, and it takes me to a bunch of, now here's where I select those dimensions. I've got a bunch of options to choose from here. So let's look at the importers and reporters. We want all of Africa. Now I wish I'd had my whole of Africa, but let's go to, I've got Africa excluding SADC. All right, so what I can do is Africa excluding SADC and then SADC. I think that will include everyone there. And then I must just fix that a bit later. So that, but now one way, I chose some country groups. They're also predefined country groups. Unfortunately, Africa as an entire continent is not here. They've got Sub-Saharan Africa and then the Middle East and North Africa, which is frustrating because you have to then, if you do Middle East, North Africa, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, you have to then delete Middle Eastern countries that are not part of Africa. But that's another way to do it. Unfortunately, they don't have one that's, or we can go from a country list, and you can just find them here and select one. Like if you go like that and I add Angola, now it's already in there, so I don't have to do that. So then I click proceed, and I've got my countries. Now I look for my products. So now I have to first, I won't search, but I'll select a nomenclature, and I'm going to scroll right down to the bottom. These, some of these nomenclatures are industry type nomenclatures, which is very useful because if you're working with industrial data rather than trade data, this has mapped trade flows and customs duties to industrial definitions of industries rather than trade definitions of products. So as long as you understand here, when we talk about industrial data, we're looking at sectors. So the sector mining, the sector quarrying, the sector livestock or agriculture. It depends on the level you go. The sector wearing apparel or clothing. But when you go to trade data, you're looking more on products. And of course, there's a relationship or correspondence between products and sectors, but the mapping is not perfect. And because there are 99 two-digit HS categories, some of them, sometimes multiple will map to an industry level, and sometimes the reverse happens. So the mapping there is not simple. So I've chosen the HS combined, all two-digit HS codes, and now I'm going to choose select from a product tree. I wanted clusters. No, so I won't go to clusters. And I could have had my predefined product groups. I'm going to instead go to select from the product tree. And if I scroll down, now you see here the two-digit with the name of the line, the name of the trade categorized product. And if I want textiles and related things, I've got to come down further, scrolling down. Here we go, and I see the first one, raw hides and skins other than fur skins. But there's leather. So I choose leather, articles of leather, and I add that. And as I said, I'm not going to choose all of them and keep going. And I'm going to add cotton because that's a textile. So you see, there's nothing that says, there's no umbrella category for textiles. I've got silk, which is a textile, wool, other vegetable textiles. So some 50 to 50, more than that actually, down to from 50 to 60 are all a type of textile. And so I must just to keep things simple. Now, cotton is one of the largest ones. From 61, we have apparel, we have clothing. So I'm going to choose the first one, which is, no, I don't want knitted or crocheted. I want not knitted or crocheted articles of apparel and clothing. And then there was one other one I added, knitted or crocheted fabrics. I think I added two. Another large category would be special woven fabrics, man-made filament strips, and the like of is. Now you can always look. That's a category of textile. You can always look on TradeMap to see what the biggest categories are. So the same data is available on TradeMap, but it's easier to see, to quickly see what the values are. And so what you would do is you would just choose the largest. I know that articles of apparel not knitted or crocheted is going to be the largest clothing category. I know that articles of leather, that's going to be the largest leather category. I know I could be, no, correction, I could be wrong there. Let me just check. All right. And yes, that's correct. And then I can, among these other ones, I can just see which is going to be the largest one. All right. So we're gonna go with with that selection there as the largest, as the four main textile categories that we use. I can't see on my screen where I'm supposed to. I need to scroll down a bit. Okay, then we proceed. Now we have our importers. All of Africa, we have our products. We've got four important CTL product lines. Now we need to choose exporters. And really, we want the same group of African countries. So let's just do what I did before. We add that, and then we add that. And now we've got the same group of importing countries. And so we can, and now we just need to select the years. Now remember, the interface here will offer you years for which there's no data. So it doesn't check.
Good morning. Are you able to slow down a little bit? I think you're a bit fast.
All right. Sorry. Yes, I am. Okay. Let me just close this in and then just go back and recap what we've done. So we've chosen a query name called CC Test Certificate Course Test. We've chosen as the importing countries, all African countries, which we did. We could have added them manually. In other words, gone through the whole list. I know them very well by now. Sometimes I still have to do a double take when I see Togo next to Tonga, or Togo next to Tonga. Of course, Togo is in Africa. Tonga is in somewhere else. And then we ideally, when you've logged in here and created an account, you create your own product groups. Then we look at our products, which we've chosen for clothing, textile, and leather-related products. And we've chosen the HS, the harmonized system combined. There's only one in WITS. There's only one HS classification, and we've chosen that. Cotton, then not knitted clothing, and then man-made filaments. So that's textile. So we've got two textile categories: cotton, and then man-made textiles. And remember that most of the clothing we wear these days is man-made. Those textiles are man-made. They are synthetic. If you're very wealthy, you may be wearing pure cotton clothing, but it's expensive. It's very comfortable, but it happens to be expensive. So textile manufacturers have come up with man-made textile materials, synthetic, and a lot of these are very wearable, and a lot of them are combined with cotton. So they're called cotton rich. Then what we did was we chose our exporters. Now the same group of countries that are importers are also exporters. And there's a simple reason for that, is because we're looking at intra-African trade. So intra-Africa means Africa trading with Africa. So we want the same group. And it looks a bit funny there. I've got two different groups. I must create a new group just with Africa excluding SADC, and then SADC. So that'll give me the same result. So that I come to, and you see at any point, if you think, oh, I've made a mistake, I can go back, or you can load an existing query and modify it. And I've done this often. For example, I'm working with, let's say we're looking at the countries of East Africa. I only want Kenya as a reporter. So I go and I do Kenya, then I come back and I change the query. I just change it to a different East African country. So you can modify queries as you will. And this is also quite powerful, because in Trade Map, you make the selections and you see your data, and then you download your data. But once you close Trade Map, if you want to come back next day, you have to do all of the selections again. Whereas here, you can just reload your query again, and you can save time that way. Again, stop me if I'm still going too quickly. Now we need to select our years. And as I was saying, you'll be offered years. If we look here, the years we can select, and those that we haven't selected any yet. But sorry, the program will offer you years for which there's no data. For example, I can guarantee you that there's no data for 2024. The only reason they've got it in there is possibly because of forecasts or predictions or simulated data. But it's not there. And even 2020 data is not that complete. So I chose 2015 or 2016. I'll tell you now. I chose the year 2015 because it's the most recent year with the most data. So I highlight 2015 and then I click the right arrow here, and then it goes into I have one selected year. But as you can see, you can select more than 1 year, but you must have first made sure that the data is in fact available. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything. So let's click proceed, and I have done that. I have done composed an entire query and then found out that there's no data. You compose the query, you think, I'm going to get just the data I want, and then when you download it, you see, oh, it's a very tiny file, and I think, oh, there's actually isn't any data. And then what we do is we submit. Oh, sorry, I've got to select tariff options. You see, it tells me, you can't submit until you select your tariff option. So I click on tariffs. Now here it's we just want the effectively applied rate. So we do want to use AVE. There's no option there. So we want the top option. We don't need the MFN applied rates or the MFN bound rates, the effectively applied rates. And that's all we need there. So I would say you can be very fancy with a query and get lots and lots of data. And then when you actually load the data into Excel, you could get a bit overwhelmed. So sometimes a simpler query is a wiser way to go than to think, oh, I can get this data and get that data, and then you have a huge file with lots and lots of data, and it can confuse you. So you submit it. It says your query was submitted successfully. To check the query status, click OK. And now what happens is you'll see here that it says waiting under status. This is where you see all your queries. Under status, it says waiting because it's busy pulling the data from the database in the background. So you have to wait a little bit simply because it's such a powerful database, because there's simply so much there. And any database that can classify your data on the fly by industry classification or by multiple industry classifications or by trade classification is powerful. And now one little caution here: when you download this data, when it's ready to download, it will show under there. When you download this data, it will sometimes you will get a warning from your antivirus program, and I don't know why that is the case. I just know that it sometimes just doesn't like the file. It doesn't like something happening, and so I had to in my previous computer where I had Kaspersky. I think, yeah, Kaspersky, I had to disable the virus program to be able to download. So Melanie asks, how do you know when a year has missing data? Melanie, what you need to do is look under data availability. So while we wait for this, let's go to support materials. And you see under here, so along here, I've got lots of drop downs. The last one, support materials, has a drop down called data availability. Now that will tell you whether a year has missing data or not. If you like, I can go there while we wait for the query. So let's go there. Now, when I click data availability, I get this schema here. I get this thing to look at. And now I need to select the database that I'm going to be using. And sometimes you go through the databases until you find the data you want. So if I select WTO IDB, which is got trade and tariff, it tells me I is imports, T is tariffs, and WTO is the integrated database, so it's tariffs and trade. Now that's what we want. We want imports, we want a trade flow, and we want tariffs. You'll see if you select some of these other ones, you don't get tariffs, or some of them you only get tariffs. But WTO IDB is an integrated database. It has tariffs and imports, and that's why we like it. That's why we use it. Now, if I scroll down, I can select countries here from here and look at it that way. So let's say I can look at Mauritania, or I can just scroll down and start to look at African countries. So let's look at Botswana. All right, so Botswana is on the second line here. Their tariffs for 2022, their imports and tariffs for 2021, etc., going back. But 2017 is missing. So if I look under the 2017 column, I see for Botswana, there's only T, there's no I, no imports, only tariffs. And so now I would have filtered on Africa, but we can just scroll down and we see, if I scroll along the bottom, I can see the further information. What I did was I downloaded this. I downloaded this as a file, and then I looked at it in Excel. So I think if you look here, let me just move this out of the way. I'm seeing a lot of stuff. So you give it a job name, you say data availability, then I called it WTO IDB, and then I gave it a description. This is data availability for WTO IDB. And then I filtered and I looked at it properly in Excel, because you aren't able to choose country groups online on the online version. So give it a name, give it a description, download it as you can download it as CSV or Excel, and then look at it in Excel. And you can also filter African countries there in Excel. So that's how I determined my data availability. Just see. Okay, Frank says registering account in which require an email address of World Bank consultant. That's very strange, Frank, because I never had that issue. I just registered. Maureen, that I can't answer your question, whether they're going to release the video. That will be Nina can follow, can come back to you on that. Amina, yes, I'm sorry. I know it's there are a lot of steps. What I'd suggest though is it may be impossible to follow everything that I do here, and they may release. We are recording this, and it may be possible that the Tralac will release the recording. I will ask Nina, and she will get back to you about that. But there are also training materials on the site. So you see under support materials, there are video tutorials, there's e-learning, there's a user manual, and there's help. So that is definitely okay. On the other question, Frank, I had no idea that you required you required this, but I'll check on that because I definitely didn't do that. I simply gave my name, my email address. I told them what industry I was from, gave them some other information, and then they registered the account. So, and this is a public portal. It's for the use of the public. There may be an issue with your country, Frank. If you could tell us what your country is, maybe there's an issue. Okay, so there, George has come back and said, just ignore that part. Okay, that's not a requirement. Thank you so much, George. That's not a requirement, and so you can ignore that part.
Sorry, John, I can let me just step in to answer Maureen and Amina's questions. You will be receiving the access to recordings at the end of every day, so you can just go over these recordings in your own time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nina, for that. Now, let's just refresh this because I've got a feeling that now sometimes you'll come to and press pause and slow motion and things like those and slow it down. All right, so now what sometimes happens when you're waiting for your download to be ready, that it doesn't update. So it says it's still waiting now. That's very unusual. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the refresh button here, which is on the left. And now you can see it says completed. Now, before you download, because downloading is a bit of a process, click on the log. You see here, there are a couple of columns. The one says the log. Click on the log to see if there were any errors, because sometimes it says error, can't find data. But here it says right, WTO integrated markets. These are reporting countries. Good. It's got all of the non-static countries. Then it's got all the static countries. So great. So that worked. So choosing Africa excluding static and static worked, and we got out. And then it did the same for the partner countries. If we scroll down, yes, it's got non-static. I see Somalia there. Yes, it's got static. I see South Africa there. And then in HS product, it's got 42, 52, the ones we selected, years 2015, and trade flows. It's imports, but it hasn't listed it there. We know they're imports because we've already specified that. All right, so that worked. I just want to look at the log of the one I did yesterday. And I selected all the African countries manually there. And so it looks exactly the same, actually. Yes, exactly the same trade flows. So it's the same data. And now the challenge, now the next step is just to download the data. And here we come to a field where it tells you whether you can download. You select Excel or CSV or Stata. I don't think many of you work in Stata. That's a dedicated analysis package. I don't really use it much except for converting files. And then don't worry about the template. You can leave that blank. But here, this is important. What we want to do is you can also leave the selected columns and the available columns exactly as they are because there's enough. But what we do want to do is select the pivot header. Now, the pivot header is going to be the reporter name. So the name of the country doing the imports, that's what we want because the importer is the one charging, the importer is the one levying the duties. So we want the name of the country next to the duties that it is levying. So we generally want that to be the reporter name, and then the pivot data is going to be the imports value. There are other options there, but we don't want them. We want them the imports value because there's going to be one imports value of a total imports that's of interest to us. Now we can choose to download that. I wonder if I'm going to get a virus report. So I can say, okay. And now I come to the download. There we go. And it says I'm ready to download it. So there is a small issue there, which is why it's only got 8 rows. And so I'm going to download the one I did yesterday. There is this, says import data.
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to go to certificate course and data and widths. You see where I've stored my data. Going to widths, and now I come to a screen. I come to the place where I've stored my data. I've got my data availability, which I downloaded, but we're not going to load that. We're going to go here, Africa CTL, tariff and trade. Everyone see that I've selected that? What I've selected. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to say import. All right, now it's going to make a connection. And now what it does is it loads this thing on. Can you see that it's loaded as sort of a sub screen? Africa CTL CSV. Or you're looking at the same blank spreadsheet?
No,
can you see?
No,
you can
it's,
see
it's copied the right way. We're looking at the Excel sheet that has the data that was transferred.
Okay. So now what I do is I see that the data looks fine. The headings are in the right place. So I click load, and here it's going to load that. So this is the data exactly as we get it from WITS, and that's what it looks like. So let me close this. The problem is I've got a bunch of Zoom things on my screen as well, which I have to keep moving around. All right. So here is the data.
Just to understand something, John.
Yes.
This data that you have copied on the Excel sheet, you got it from the WITS, the WITS platform, and then you copied it in your laptop and stored it in a particular file.
Yes. The download, the only part I left out is when I click download, because you sometimes have to disable your antivirus program to download it. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense, but it's a little hiccup that I just wanted to avoid. But this is the query that we prepared. This is exactly what the data looks like. What we're going to clean this up a bit. So we are going to rationalize this to some extent. You see that there's more information here than we really need. So what I want to do is, let's just scroll to the right, and we see we've got a whole lot of columns. We've got, firstly, what's very important, the reporter name. All right, look here. Those are the reporters. Those are the countries that are importing from the other African countries. So if I click the drop down, you see I go here, I can click a drop down. Can you see the list of African countries there?
Yes.
That we've got. Now, that's not a full set of African countries. And those of you from East Africa will immediately say, where's Kenya? And I'm sad to say its data wasn't available for this year. So I got the best year for the most amounts of countries and of countries and products, and that was the one we got. So unfortunately, Kenya is not there. One could always select multiple years, and because with trade and tariffs, you could select, say, 3 or 4 years and then just average between them. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Average the trade data between them, and because the tariffs won't really change much in 3 years. But that's the way it was. So Amina, I just wanted to see in the chat again. Someone has said, Amina said, you don't need a World Bank consultant email if you want to register an account. Just ignore that. But what I would recommend is don't do that now. Rather pay attention here and go through that a bit later. All right. So the most important ones are reporter name. We've got those. The product. Now the reporter code is next to the reporter name. Sometimes we use the code, whether it's a numerical or a text code, to reference because names can be misspelled. So, for example, Cape Verde is sometimes spelled Cabo Verde, which is the original name. And another name that always trips us up is Sao Tome et Principe, which is sometimes just written Sao Tome and Principe without the diacritics. And Democratic Republic of Congo is sometimes Congo, dem.rep. Or sometimes just Congo.dem. .rep or Republic, or it says Republic of. And sometimes Tanzania is just Tanzania, and other times it's Tanzania Republic of. So these cause data issues. So to get around that, we sometimes just use the code, country code. Now to use the code, you need a mapping from the code to the name, a standardized mapping. Obviously, you have a mapping here, but you don't know if your country name is correct. There's also a text mapping, which is the ISO code, and that's the one I use. Okay, I realize there's a huge amount of information. We've still got about 50 minutes to go. So we've got the reporter name, the reporter code, the product code. That's the HS2 code, remember? We've got the product name. We've got the tariff year, 2015. Now, the tariff year and the trade year, don't worry too much about that, because sometimes there is a small difference between that, but we're not concerned with that. We have the trade source, we have the duty type, AHS, and then we have a simple average of the duties that have been applied. That's an average over all the countries for which this imports value has been imported from. Imports value in 1,000 in thousands of US dollars. So what we're looking at here is 20. That's not a huge amount of money. 20,000 USD. There are larger amounts in there, but these can be quite small flows depending on the country and depending on the product category. Then there's a total for Africa excluding SADC, and then there are totals for each country. So they did put in an aggregation for Africa excluding SADC. I wonder if they put one in for SADC. I don't see it actually, but we're gonna discard that, and then we've got countries from Angola right the way through to Zambia, 47 countries. So that's a good set of partner countries for each importing country. Now what I'm going to do is just delete some of these columns that are not necessary. I previously did this, but you couldn't see the sheet that I was dealing with. So let's say delete. So I just click on an entire column. I go delete. I'm going to leave the reporter code in, the product code in, the product name, the tariff and the trade year. I'm going to delete the trade year. Really, we can delete the tariff year as well because we know it's 2015. So let's just delete that. We know it's all 2015. I'm going to delete the trade source, the duty type. So I could have unselected those at the download stage, but I didn't. Now that it starts to look a lot more workable, we've got our reporter name, our importer, we've got the product being imported, we've got a simple average of all the tariffs, and then we've got the imports value in US dollars. Now, I'm going to insert a calculation here. I'm going to insert a column. So I go right-click, insert, which is my calculate. I'm going to call it calculated average. Calculated average. And I'm going to calculate my own average of all African countries. And this is important because it should give us an idea of how much of these imports come from countries or sources that are not listed here. So bear with me. I will be with you. All right, so I click average and I select all the African countries, and then my calculated average says, it gives me a range of numbers there, some of which are this error code, which means that there is no tariff for any of the countries. There's no tariff listed for any of the countries. Oh, there's Senegal. Okay, there's a problem there. Let me just double check. Why is that the case? Oh, what if this is It's not text. This could be, sometimes this is one of those cases where a number is actually text. So we can do a simple check. We can put in this checker called is text, and then I select that. True, so it is text. All right. I didn't have this issue in my trial run yesterday, but that's the Murphy's Law, hey? It's definitely the average for Angola to Zimbabwe, and it gives me a div naught. Very strange. Okay. That's a bit of a problem for me. Let's try it from the other perspective. So again, I'm calculating my own average as a way of cross-checking that the simple average calculation they've given us is actually correct. And I get the same issue. So let's just delete that. All right. What I'm going to go to now is my sheet. Now, having showed you how to import this and also simplify the data, I'm going to go back to now my sheet where I've worked through some of the things, and you'll see that I'm not cheating out of anything, because you'll see the data is exactly the same, but it's just something that I've done a full test run on, and so I know that there are no nasty surprises for me, because there is definitely a type of Murphy's Law that comes into play. All right. So what I've done here is I've calculated the averages. I've got the same products, the same countries, and the same, it's all the same year, as we know. But what I've done is I've calculated my own average, which goes down here. It does calculate correctly this time. And some of the averages have got this error thing, which means that the imports that have been imported are not from any of the countries that are listed here, any of these African countries. And so I've made the assumption that where there's this error, the imports have come from the rest of the world. It could be a total thrown in, or not necessarily the case, but that's just an assumption I've made. Now what I've done is I've taken this data and we call it stacking it. So instead of the countries being in columns along here, as you can see, that's very cumbersome to work with. I've taken them and I've done this, which is stacking them, where the countries are in a column. They're in a column, they're in a single, sorry, they're in one column, which means the country names are in rows. So I've renamed the data. We've still got reporter name, reporter. I'll talk about that now. And we have don't worry about some of the other data that I've thrown in, but we've got the countries in rows. Now I've added some other information in. You'll see I've added a column called reporter rec. Reporter rec is the regional economic community or the preferential trade area of the reporting country. And that helps us to understand where, or rather gives us the ability to analyze by regional economic community and not just by the country name. Now you'll notice I put the same data in for the partner rec. So I put the data in for the partner rec. So Senegal is ECOWAS. Now, another important thing here is that because we have multiple overlapping rec memberships, we have to make a choice. And I've got a table that I call categories, where I've got all of the countries of the world and a whole bunch of categories that I map for these tables. And so I have a column called main rec. And you see it's quite dark there, but that says main rec, where if it's not an African country, that it's, I say, rest of world. And if it's an African country, I give it the main rec it's a member of. So if we go to Kenya, Kenya is a member of how many? 4 recs. But its main rec is the EAC. So there's Kenya. I'm going to highlight it. Kenya's main rec is the EAC. And that helps me to just keep things manageable. Let me just move this out of the way. Okay. All right. So that I just used a mapping to map Kenya, here it is, to the EAC, and these are all the partner countries. Now there's one final thing I'm going to show you. I put in a new column called SameRec. SameRec compares, there's the formula. SameRec compares the partner rec to the reporter rec, and it tells you whether they're it gives you a no if they're not the same rec, and it gives you a yes if they are the same rec. Now that will help us. So if we use the same rec category, we can find all intra-rec trade. So if I click on the drop down and I click yes, we then have a bunch. We then have all the intra-rec trade, and I can choose which rec if I want to look at SADC, which is there, and that's I'm now looking at all intra-rec trade. But we're not going to analyze in this field in this thing. We're going to pivot the data, but before we pivot the data, I'm going to go back to my Power Pivot, my PowerPoint, and just talk through what we did there. All right. Okay, this div naught, I didn't get the same result the second time around. It's a typical Murphy's Law thing, so just ignore what I've written there. I will edit it in the version you receive. But for now, we've done this. Which of the columns are redundant? We've deleted the redundant columns. Okay, the Nomen column, we don't need that. The year column, we don't need that because it's all 2015. We created a new column. All right, so we ignore point 2 because I've got different results, and I'm not happy about that, and so it's not important. Then we use drop-down filters to just look at some of the data. We'll go back and do this now. Use the drop-down filters to select South Africa as importer, and also Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, and Egypt. Calculate the value of rest of world imports of preferences versus the value of imports of MFN rates. What is the proportion? For each, what is the highest intra-African tariff charged for each of the 4 CTL categories, and what countries pay this tariff? We're going to do part of this using the drop downs, but we're going to ignore the rest of world data because that I'm not confident on. All right, so all of our filters are off. So we go to reporter name and we choose South Africa. Oh, you're not seeing this. Let me just go back. South Africa, Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt. Okay, Egypt. You see I'm selecting them here. Ghana's not there. Okay, that's a pity. So we don't have a noise Nigeria. We don't have a complete set of reporters, but we'll select South Africa and Egypt. So we have 2 countries here. We have their recs, and we look across to see what is the highest of the tariffs that were charged. So if I want to see the highest of the tariff charge, I've selected my 2 countries. I can go to this column, simple average, which is a simple average of the tariffs charged, and I can say sort them largest to smallest. That's the way I can rank them from the largest to smallest. Is everyone with me? Just check. Thank you, Nina. I know. Okay. Chinradzo asked a very important question. How do you decide a main rec for a country? For example, Zimbabwe is in Aradzo. What I did was I had to choose where they're overlapping rec memberships. So in the case of Zimbabwe, geographically, it's closer to the other SADC countries. COMESA is a very dispersed rec. So I generally did not choose COMESA as a main rec because of that, and also because the preferential trade area utilization, the utilization is not as high in COMESA. That's based on work that I've done and other researchers have done on utilization. So I chose SADC, and I did the same logic for Kenya. Kenya is also a member of COMESA, and 1 or 2 more. But I chose EAC because EAC is a customs union. So that's the logic in choosing that. So we choose a main rec, and yes, it's not perfect, and yes, we will get some, we will lose some information, but we have to make a choice to do analysis such as this. So now, having chosen South Africa and Egypt, two important importers of textiles and clothing and leather, we've ranked the simple average of the tariffs from the top to bottom, and we see South Africa is the standout winner. South Africa has got tariffs from 45 right down to 32. And remember, these are against other African countries. These are tariffs that are applied to African countries because we've only got those totals in the data. If we scroll down to Egypt, we see Egypt does not have the same extent. So Egypt's highest tariff is 30. All right, it's 2/3 of South Africa's highest tariff. And bear in mind, Egypt has made offers to AFCFTA on exactly these lines and has offered to wind these lines down to 0. So it's going to go from 30 currently. Angola pays 30% on its imports to Egypt, although they're very small. South Africa's are not small, $380,000. It's not a big shipment, but paying 30% tariff. That will go down to 0 under the AFCFTA. So I know, okay, I want to say, I know this is quite overwhelming. We're dealing with a huge amount because I'm looking at, to some extent, raw data, to some extent, data that's not been fully processed and that has missing items. But we can still get an idea of an analysis. But this is not how we do the analysis. We do it through pivoting. And I'll do that now. I'm just going to see if there are any questions. So yes, thank you for asking. If something says NA, it means not available. And the question, George asked a very important question. Why do we have different tariffs for different countries within the same reg? So that's because there's always the potential for exclusions. Especially in free trade areas, there can be exclusions. So it could just be a sector. And as I said at the start of this presentation, the clothing, textile, and leather sector is one where it's quite highly protected, both in Africa and throughout the world. And so it could just be excluded from those specific ones. And going into the AFCFTA, it's possible that some countries will continue to either exclude the clothing, textile, and leather sector, or to denote it as sensitive. And that's why you see this happening. I'm just looking at scanning if there are any more questions. All right, product category. I didn't see that, but okay. So now let's get back to our PowerPoint. And I know you. All right, let's just stop share and change the share to our PowerPoint. I've already gone through this, but we've added the columns. Sorry. We've added the data columns reporter rec and partner rec using a reference table. I showed you how I did that. So for those, we had to choose a main rec. We had to choose between EAC and COMESA for Kenya. We chose EAC. For Zimbabwe, we had to choose between SADC and COMESA. We chose SADC. Why? Because although they're both free trade areas, the SADC free trade area, I believe, is more fully implemented. And there's likely to be more trade just on geographic basis between Zimbabwe and the nations of the members of SADC, rather than Zimbabwe and the members of COMESA. So that's when you do research, you have to make calls like that. And this will enable us to evaluate inter-rec levels of protection, because not all African recs are free trade areas or preferential trade areas. And as we see, even in those that are, we still have tariffs that are applied against other nations. And there's one other thing I must say, and I know this is a very there's a lot of information in this presentation, and I guess once you start working with data, you go down a rabbit hole, and you have to just deal with it. Is that the data was from 2015, so even within some of these recs, there may still have been wind down. Some countries may have been going through wind down phases with tariffs, where they're winding tariffs down So if for 2015 there's a tariff, that may be gone by 2022. Unfortunately, as you saw from the data availability, there's a lot of missing data for 2022. But that would be, if you were to do this as a formal paper, it would be one of the things you'd have to look into. So you would go and find the tariff data, because I think there was tariff data for 2022 there for some countries, but there wasn't much imports data. And go and see, all right, in 2015, it was 30%. By 2022, it had been wound down to 15%. All of those factors. So I'm giving you lots and lots of things to think about. All right, and let's do some proper analysis now by generating some table and chart. Let's collect the following regs: SADC, EAC, and ECOWAS. We're collecting them because they're geographical. They're not stretched out like COMESA. They're all free trade areas, and we know that there's intra-trade between those countries. Let's tabulate the country, the imports from most favored nation, the imports from preferential trade areas, the duties to most favored nation, the duties to preferential trade areas, the preference margin. That's the difference between the most favored nation tariff and the preferential tariff, and the proportion of most favored nation imports to preferential imports. In other words, I'm going to divide the total imports that come from tariffed countries by the total imports that come from non-tariffed, in other words, free trade countries. So we expect to see that the proportion is always going to be less than 1. In other words, we expect that usually there'll be more imports coming from preferential countries than are coming from tariffed countries. Okay, so MFN are tariffed countries, PTA are non-tariffed or preferential, or possibly, again, another proviso, a preferential tariff may not be 0, could be, but the idea is less than the MFN import. And also we're looking at average tariffs. So we may see a positive preferential tariff because that reflects a disaggregate amount of tariff lines, some of which are 0 and some of which are not. So when we average them, we get a non-zero average tariff. Okay, so there's so many things going on here, and I thank you for bearing with me. Any new questions? Okay. Choose appropriate charts. Now, the great thing is Excel can help us choose a chart, bearing in mind that they need to keep the charts not too busy. What patterns, if any, can we see? Is there a difference between recs? Okay, so those are our research questions. Do we have another slide? No. So that's all, and we've got a nice 30 minutes left to do that, and we should have time for questions. So let me go back to the spreadsheet. Always a bit clunky. So to answer those questions, we need to pivot the data. Now, to pivot the data, what we do is we have to move things around the whole time. You click in the top left cell. Click in the top left cell, and then Control A, which selects all the data, and then we go Insert Pivot Table. And then it's going to ask you where you want the pivot table, and it's going to throw a pivot table there. I've already done it, so I'm not going to do it again. But I called it pivot stacked because it's my stacked data, and that's what it looks like, with some information already applied. So let me just replicate that. What I've done is, now when we pivot, you'll see on the right-hand side here, we can drag any of these fields
into... Will you just kindly repeat the process again, please?
Pardon, I didn't get that, George.
You just kindly restart the process again.
Restart the process.
Yeah, from the yes, thank you.
Okay, let me just then I'm going to put in a completely new pivot table, and we go from there, and let's call it pivot 2. All right. So that's what I get when I start the pivot table. I'm going to flip back to my PowerPoint. You can't see it. So we choose country, imports from MFA, imports from PTA, duties to MFA, duties to PTA, preference margin, proportion of MFA imports. All right, we're gonna have to calculate some of those fields. But what we always do, the first thing we come to a pivot table is we choose our data. So we've got sum of imports, and the other thing we want is our tariff faced. And we don't want the sum of tariffs, we want the average of tariffs faced. So we've got two things in our pivot table already. We've got sum of imports and we've got the tariff faced. The only problem is we don't have any thing regarding the countries. So I'm going to just go back and see. Now we want to go by rec. So we are going to go to, we're going to take a field called reporter rec and put it in there in that filter field, and we're going to start off with just SADC. So now we've only got SADC. You see when I change that filter, it's a filter reporter rec to SADC, then I get sum of value and then average of tariff faced. I would like to format these differently. I'm hoping it'll last thing, but I don't like that way of formatting. So I go here, don't worry too much about this. I'm just going to format that so I've got, and that looks like currency, and I don't want so many decimal places here. All right, you see I've just changed the format of that. Just going to come back here. Now we want reporter name in the rows. So I drag reporter name down to the rows, and I see for everything, for SADC, for all SADC countries, the sum of their imports in US dollars thousands and the average tariff faced from the import. So that's the average tariff faced by the exporters, okay, which aren't listed here. But we know those exporters are African countries because this is intra-African trade. Just go back, and now we end. And now what we want to do is we want to list the rec on the, we want to list the rec across the top. So we're not going to be looking at the partner countries. We're just going to be looking at whether it's from the same rec or not. Now, no means it's imports from, it's not from the same rec. So it's extra rec. It's coming from a different rec. And yes means it is from the rec. So just by adding the field same rec to the columns, I've got additional data here, and it's nicely formatted. I've got the totals on the extreme right-hand side, and then I've got the subtotals of disaggregate for the rec for the non-rec members, and then for the rec members. And if we look at this data, we see, look at the total for imports from the rec, 881,000. Sorry, that's more. That's 881 million USD imports, whereas from outside the rec, the rest of Africa, only 25 million. So we can do a quick ratio, we can calculate that divided by that. All right, I'd rather, it doesn't like it because they're totals. So it's only 3%. If I put that into percentage terms, it's 3%. In SADC, let's summarize what this data is telling us. In SADC, the total of total of imports of clothing, textile, and other products from, in our 4 categories, from non-SADC partners is only 3% of the total imports from SADC partners. So that shows you that clearly SADC members prefer to import their CTL from trade partners and it's going to be obvious. This is obviously going to be more viable for them, for the trade partners, because they get preferential access. Now, if we look at the tariff faced, we see the average tariff faced by non-REC members is 19%. The average tariff faced by REC members is 4.4%. The question came up, and it's a good question. Why is it not zero? Because within those two-digit HS categories, you're averaging over possibly hundreds of tariff lines, some of which are naught, some of which are not naught. And so you get a non-zero total, because even in SADC, which is a free trade area, we do not have perfect free trade. We still have some protection, some lines which are excluded, and we should see the same thing in the AFCFTA. Now, if we repeat this exercise, it's fascinating to repeat this exercise for the other. Let's go to the EAC. We just choose our drop down on the top left there. And here the EAC is a similar story. I'll calculate, let's just delete that. So here there's a much EAC intra-trade, but not a lot of trade with outside of the customs union. Although the ratio is greater than in the case of SADC, and just double check, yes, that's correct, at 12%. So we likewise with SADC, we see that in the EAC, the bulk of their clothing, textile, and leather imports from other African countries come from within the EAC, but 12% come from outside, more than the 3% that applies to SADC. So there's still, but now let's look at the average tariff faced by those non-EAC members is 26%. You see how uniform the members of the EAC are. They're very, very uniform. So the EAC, being a customs union, is far more complete, far more implemented. You know, and with the intra-trade tariffs being zero, there aren't those exclusions and possibly sensitive categorizations that you see in SADC. The average tariff faced by members is zero. It's zero. But that faced by my non-REC partners is higher at 26%. Still not as high as the 40% plus that South Africa imposes on this. Are we okay, guys? I know this is a bit exhausting, but we're getting somewhere. I've yet to show you the charts we're going to invest in. Let's finally look at ECOWAS, because we don't have enough data for the other categories. I know what it doesn't like, the fact that it's going to overwrite that. So let's choose ECOWAS, and there we go. Again, in ECOWAS, we have a similar story of much more intra-trade, intra-African trade in CTL coming from partners in ECOWAS than in the rest. And in this case, what is it? 6.7%, 6.8%. So interesting. It's fascinating that within our preferential trade areas, we see that intra-trade in a protected item, a highly protected item like clothing, textile, and leather, is always much higher with REC partners than with non-REC partners. But what does this tell us about the African continental free trade area? It means that there certainly are producers within Africa. ECOWAS is capable of importing clothing, textile, and leather from South Africa, from Egypt, from Mauritius, which are exporters of those products, but it will need to open its markets. So ECOWAS has made an offer to the AFCFTA, and they will need to open their markets if that's to happen. Okay, Blessed has made an important comment. From the SADC and non-SADC countries, it connotes that SADC countries maximize the free trade area. In this regard, we can assume that AFCFTA will boost intra-African trade against the current reality because of low tariffs within AFCFTA. That's exactly, Blessed, that's exactly my point. And I think this data makes it clear. So do you see how you can find fascinating insights through getting some data, cleaning it up a bit and pivoting it? But what I want to show now is the more refined data. So I think I always have a sheet called results, and now I've pulled some of this data into the results. I'm not going to show too much of that because I think I've got a better one. I think, no, here, this is the best ones. So results 2 are where I pull the data for the three regional economic communities, and then I do another column. I calculate what's called the preference margin for each of these sets. So it's the same data as you saw in the pivot table. I just add a new column called the preference margin. You can see it's the difference between the tariff MFN and the tariff preference. That's called the preference margin, and it's in the EAC it's equivalent to the MFN tariff because the preferential tariff is 0. That's not the case in the other 2 groupings. And then I also calculate the ratio of preferential and non-preferential imports by each country. And we see it varies by country. So Burundi, it's only 8% non-preferential imports. Rwanda is 7.5%, Uganda 16.7%. But we don't have Kenya. As I said, sadly, we don't have Kenya. We maybe need it different. Let's scroll up to SADC. SADC, we have a fascinating insight here. Comoros, which is an island state, a small island state, pretty much imports more than twice from non-preferential sources as from preferential. And that could have a lot to do with its geographic location, is that it's just easier for it to do that. So it's non-preferential imports are coming in at 20%. I see, but there its preferential is also 20%. Okay, so that means Comoros is not fully integrated into SADC. So that's interesting. If we look at another country, Mauritius. Mauritius preferential tariff in SADC is 0. Okay, so it has implemented. Its MFN tariff is only 5%. And so for that reason, there is 28% of its CTL imports are non-preferential. But that's sort of expected because the preference margin is low. So look at the preference margin column, look at the color. If it's green, the margin is high. If it's red or orange, the margin is low. And we see that where it's green, the ratio of non-preferential to preferential imports is low, and the opposite generally applies in SADC. What this is saying is simply saying the bigger the preference margin, the more likely that imports will be only at preferences. The smaller the preference margin, the more likely it is that imports will be from non-preferential sources, as we see in the case of Mauritius. That clearly shows the pattern. Malawi shows the pattern as well. So why Malawi's preference margin is so small, I don't understand. Well, its tariff is very small. Its MFN tariff is very small. So look at SADC, and there's a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of different. South Africa, that's fascinating. So South Africa, we know, has got very high peak tariffs. So the peak tariff, the maximum tariffs are sort of around 45, and then the average is 30. And we see that only 0.9, only 1% of South Africa's intra-African CTL imports are not at preferences. Only about 1%. That's what happens when you have such high peak and average tariffs. Now, if we look at the other countries, the pattern breaks down a bit, but I'm not going to look. I'm going to show you the charts because that's the final. That's really what we want. We want these charts because that visually shows us the data. And I've only plotted the preference margin and the ratio of preferential to preferential imports. And what we expect is we expect the orange line, which is the ratio, to be high, to be the opposite of the blue line. A very, very valuable contribution by Guilherme. Guilherme says Angola, Comoros, and I think you mean DRC have not ratified the SADC trade protocol, hence the high non-pref to pref ratio. It might still be that Comoros is importing from other SADC, but paying paying the MFN duty. Thank you very much. So Guilherme, that's exactly the kind of analysis that we want, is to dig into this and find out who's not ratified the SADC protocol. So Angola, yes, I see in Angola, I don't see preferential trade. And this same thing comes up when we look at other product categories as well. Comoros is the same, and the DRC. We don't have the DRC on here, but that's a valuable point. So when we look at data like this, that's the meaning of analysis, is to dig down into it. But let's come back to the chart, and we see that as I said, we expect the orange line to be the opposite of the blue line. Where the blue lines are low or non-existent, we expect the orange line to be high. And so we see the pattern does apply for SADC, but it doesn't apply very well for, doesn't necessarily apply. Yeah, for EAC, it's sort of applies because the blue line is high when the orange is low for the things. And for, incidentally, yeah, okay, that's fine. And in ECOWAS, it breaks down. The relationship really doesn't break down, which is interesting. It could mean a range of things. There are not many important CTL producers in ECOWAS, and the tariffs are not very high. They're not very well protected. So the preference margins are not high. Let's look at the preference margins are not particularly high. Because on the right-hand side, we've got the ratio, and on the left-hand side, we've got the preference margin. We just double-check that. ECOWAS, yeah. The average preference margin in ECOWAS is 13%. In SADC, it's 10% with very high peaks, and in EAC, it's 26%. So in ECOWAS, we don't necessarily see the pattern because we don't have any really major. If we looked at the totals for CTL exports, compared them with CTL exporters like Egypt, Mauritius, and South Africa, that may explain that. So what you want to do then is you will be taking these charts. The charts don't have all the data. They try and focus the reader on just the relationship between the preference margin and the ratio of non-preference to preference imports. So for SADC, you can tell that story. For EAC, yes, the story still applies. One thing that I don't like about this is it shouldn't have the grand total, but that's fine. But in ECOWAS, it doesn't. And so that's an interesting story to tell there on the differences between this. Nina says we need to conclude at 11:55 as we're at Mauritania webinar starting at 12 and Zoom. Okay, we do need to conclude soon. I apologize for glitches and for the pace it's had to go, but we will make the video available. But we still have time for some questions. We still got 5 minutes. If we have questions, I thank you for everyone who's contributed during the presentation, whether it's to ask me to slow down or to clarify or to make valuable inputs, give based on your knowledge of the situation, such as Guilherme has made and Blessed has made. That's what it's all about, is looking at the data and then going and doing a research, drawing on your knowledge and making insights. So if we have any more questions in the last couple of minutes, we can host them. You're welcome to ask away.
Hello.
Yes, Lest. I can hear you.
Thank you for a job well done. In as much as I understand that this class is solemnly focused on AFCFTA and trying to bring some interpretation of what we will experience when the AFCFTA is fully kickstarted. I would love to make a small comment to see if you can give us a small insight into a bilateral trade relationship, because this is more of a multilateral trade. If you can give us a sample on WITS on how to draw conclusions on bilateral trade relationship, let's say between Nigeria and South Africa, and we can draw conclusions on that to know the balance of trade. I think I'll appreciate that, because it will set a very good example for us to understand when it comes to multilateral trade relationship on WITS. Thank you.
Okay, so blessed, and I think that's the last question we can answer given the time. We have to close it wants to know about bilateral. If I go to my stack data, then I see that I do have bilateral information here. So if I just search on South Africa, so let's say that South Africa is my country of interest, or two, I'm going to remove that. All of the countries represented in the partners. So if I look here, this column, these are all bilateral relationships with South Africa. So by selecting a specific reporter, I can then narrow down bilateral partnerships. Let me select South Africa, and we don't have Egypt as a partner. That's just unfortunate. Mauritius. So if I want bilateral between South Africa and Mauritius, remember I've only got 4 categories. That tells me what I need to know. I've got South Africa. They're both members of SADC. I've got my 4 categories. I've got my total imports value. You can see there are high values. Articles of apparel and clothing is the largest one, and then the simple average, the tariff-based 0. So you can see that gives me by just filtering here. Now, if I want to derive a table on this, I must rather pivot it. Let's go to somewhere like Lesotho, which is also. Let's go to a non. I'm just taking a complete flyer here because we're nearly out of time. A non-SADC partner, Tanzania is a SADC partner. We have Kenya. We've got Kenya on the right-hand side. So South Africa and Kenya, they're not tariff partners. Look at the average tariffs that South Africa is charging to Kenya. On cotton, it's 22%, but it's as high as 40% on clothing. And look at the value. The values are very low. So perfect example, we've compared bilateral South Africa and Mauritius. We see one thing. We compared South Africa and Kenya. We see a different thing. So, all right, I really will have to conclude there. Nina, I'm going to send you an email with the fixed power pivot, the fixed PowerPoint, and then anything else. I guess it will come up as anything else is needed from that. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. It's 11:55.
Thank you so much, John. We are heading straight onto our Mauritania webinars. If anyone wants to join, please do. But otherwise, enjoy your break, and we'll see you in 2 hours' time.
Thanks so much, Nina. I'll see you in 2 hours' time. And thank you, everybody, for your participation. And enjoy if you are going to do the Mauritania. And I'll see you this afternoon. I think, am I on Teams this afternoon, Nina?
No, we're staying on Zoom.
Zoom. Okay. All right. Fantastic. Enjoy. See you in 2 hours' time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.